The machete bit into green wood with a crack that scattered parakeets from the canopy overhead. Zenobio pulled the blade free, examined the cut, not clean enough, not at the angle he wanted, and struck again. 85 years old, arms like braided rope under papery skin, and he could still read the grain of a tree the way most people read a newspaper. The sapucaia he'd chosen stood 22 meters tall, with a trunk wider than his arm span.
Almost there.
Old growth. The kind of wood that laughed at termites,
Yes,
shrugged
but
off
necessary.
rot, and held weight that would buckle steel. He'd been building with this species for 60 years. The tree had been growing here for 200. They understood each other. Floodwater had risen a meter overnight. From where Zenobio stood on his makeshift platform, lashed between two branches 4 meters up, he could see the brown water line creeping through the forest. His stilt house downstream had survived 43 floods. 43. He'd built it at 42 years old, and it still stood, though the water this year was testing it in ways that made the posts groan at night, like something alive and hurting. This year's flood was different. The old men at the floating market, the ones even older than Zenobio, if that was possible, said the water hadn't been this high since 1971. The river was rewriting rules, and Zenobio's stilt house, designed for 15-meter floods, was staring down 17 meters of brown water with nowhere left to climb. So he was building something new. Not a stilt house, those depended on posts sunk into ground that was becoming irrelevant. A tree house, anchored to living wood, a structure that would rise with the water because the tree itself rose with the water, roots drinking the flood.
Senhor Zenobio, minha mãe diz que o senhor é louco. Ela diz que velho construindo nas árvores está pedindo a Deus para levá-lo cedo.
Naira appeared every day around noon, when the heat pressed down like a wet hand, and everyone with sense stayed in
Just
their
the wind in the
hammocks.
leaves, little one.
12
It
years
means
old,
rain is coming.
skinny as a fishing pole, bare feet gripping the branch below his platform with the casual confidence of someone who'd grown up climbing. She brought him water in a repurposed motor oil jug, and questions that nobody else bothered to ask. Her mother, Donna Carminda, lived in the last stilt house on the eastern bank. Good woman, terrible builder. Her house listed so badly to the right that Zenobio had to look away when he passed it,
Then we'll get
the
wet.
way a musician flinches at an out-of-tune instrument.
Tell your mother that God already tried to take me in 1983, 2009, and last
Thank you.
March,
Keep
when
watching
that
the
branch
horizon.
fell. He keeps missing. I think he's got
You must
bad
hold the
aim.
machete here, see? Firm,
Naira
not
laughed,
tight. The weight is
a
key.
sound that
Now watch
cut
closely.
clean
This angle is
through
what
the
counts. Got
muggy
it?
air.
I think so, yes.
She settled onto a branch 2 meters below his
Isn't that a
platform
guy
and watched him
no?
work. This had become their routine. He built, she watched, she asked. He answered with more detail than she'd requested because nobody else was asking,
Too soft.
and the knowledge had to go somewhere. Zenobio's
looking.
hands moved through the work with a precision that contradicted his age, selecting each beam by sound, knocking the wood with his knuckle, listening for the deep tone that meant density, rejecting anything that rang hollow, lashing joints with cipo vines twisted into rope. Same technique his father used, his grandfather before that. 3 generations of flood builders, and Zenobio was the last. His son Itamar had left for Manaus 14 years ago. Took a job at the industrial district, married a woman from Belém, had children who'd never seen a flood from the inside. He called on a satellite phone every few months, the connection cutting in and out, his voice sounding further each time,
Zenobio, can you hear me?
not just in
It's
distance,
breaking up. Something's
in
wrong.
understanding.
Papai, come to Manaus. There's a room here. You don't have to live like this anymore.
Live like What?
Live
Like a
what?
man who could read wood by touch and build houses that outlasted concrete. Like someone who understood the flood wasn't a disaster, it was a calendar.
True.
The river rose and fell,
True.
and everything worth knowing lived in the rhythm between those
Into
two
the hole.
states. Zenobio drove another peg into the joint and tested the beam. Solid. True. The tree absorbed the weight without complaint. He patted the trunk the way you'd pat a horse that trusted you, and reached for the next timber. Below, the water kept rising. It had swallowed the forest floor 3 weeks ago,
I must climb
and now
higher to
it was
build.
coming for the
It's
lower
getting late.
branches.
Not late enough.
Steady,
I
patient,
have time, but not
the
much.
kind of rising that didn't announce itself, just showed up each morning 2 centimeters higher and kept that pace until it decided to stop.
How do you
Zenobio
know which
looked down
branches
at the
can hold
water
the
line,
weight?
then up at his
How do you
platform.
know it won't crack?
8 meters of air between them. Enough for now.
I
Maybe
remember,
not for next week.
30 years ago. You look at me now, and you see the question. It has been 30 years.
Zenobio paused.
Are you the one?
He'd been asked this before, by Itamar, once, 30 years ago. The boy had listened for maybe 4 minutes before wandering off to kick a ball with the neighbor's kids. That was the last time Itamar asked about building.
Use
This
the bark for
girl,
healing,
though,
the leaves
this
for
girl
shelter.
was still here,
Stay away
still
from the red
watching,
fruit.
still
The red
asking.
fruit.
And the answer mattered enough to get right, because the answer was 60 years of listening to wood, and he wasn't sure he had another 60 years to find someone else who wanted to hear it. Day 6 of building. The platform had become a floor. 8 square meters of fitted planks locked together with tongue and groove joints so tight you couldn't slide a leaf between them. Zenobio ran his palm across the surface every morning, checking for warping, checking for flex. The wood was honest. It told you truth if you had patience to listen. Walls went up next. Not solid walls. That would catch wind during storms and turn the whole structure into a sail. He wove a lattice of thin canaranas and buriti palm instead. Tight enough to block rain at an angle, but
Why don't
open
you
enough
use
to let air
nails?
pass through. Same design his
Everyone
grandfather
else uses
used on the
nails.
original family house
This is
before
a
the
cipo vine.
1953 flood took it
Stronger than it
downstream in
looks.
pieces. Zenobio held up a cipo vine, twisted, dried, stronger than it looked. He wrapped it around the joint where wall met floor, pulled it tight with a technique that involved his teeth, one of his last remaining useful ones, and knotted it in a way that tightened under pressure instead of slipping.
Nails are rigid. The tree moves in wind. It bends in storms. Nails crack the wood when the tree flexes, and then your house cracks with it.
Wrap it like
Vines
this,
bend
Naira.
with
Good.
the tree. The whole structure moves like a living
See how
thing.
it's done? Full heart.
That's why my
Yes.
houses survive
Now you
when
try.
nail houses
I will
don't.
get it.
Naira nodded. She was taking notes. Not on paper, they didn't have paper to waste, but in her head. The same way Zenobio had learned, by watching hands and memorizing movements, understanding that the knowledge lived in the doing, not in diagrams. The roof frame went up on day 8.
Try.
Zenobio used the tree's own canopy as the
Yeah,
primary rain shield, building his structure underneath the broadest branch spread. The frame was insurance, a skeleton of poles that would hold
Good.
palm thatch if the canopy
true.
thinned or a storm tore
That
leaves away.
Is the
He
difference.
stood on his finished floor, 85 years old, sweat cutting channels through sawdust on his face, hands raw from vine work, and looked at what he'd built. It was good, better than good. The floor didn't sway. The wall lattice breathed. The roof frame sat square and true. A home in the sky, 12 meters above water that had no ceiling and no mercy. This was what he left behind. Not children who remembered him. Itamar called less every year, and the Manaus grandchildren wouldn't
You only heard
recognize
about houses
Zenobio
after
on
they
the street.
collapsed.
Not stories. Who told
This was
stories
his
about
voice
builders?
speaking after he
Nobody
couldn't.
wrote songs about the man whose house didn't fall down. You only heard about houses after they collapsed. But this structure, this was his voice speaking after he couldn't. Every joint said something about what he knew. Every beam was a sentence in a language fewer and fewer people could read. The water rose another 8 centimeters that night. He measured by notches cut into the sapucaia's trunk, one per day, recording the flood's appetite. The pattern wasn't linear. It was accelerating.
Senor Zenobio, my mother moved our things to the second platform. She says if the water rises another 2 meters, we go to the school shelter in Karawari.
Karawari, nearest town, 4 hours by motorboat. Concrete buildings and government cots and the buzz of fluorescent lights. The thought made Zenobio's skin crawl. Day 9. The twist arrived without warning, the way the river's worst moments always did. Not water, not a storm, not a snake or caiman, or any of the 1,000 dangers in the várzea. Itamar's boat arrived at dawn. Zenobio heard the motor before he saw it, an outboard he didn't recognize, too powerful for narrow channels, driven by someone who didn't know to cut throttle near flooded trees. The wake rocked his stilt house hard enough to knock a pot off the shelf. His son climbed the ladder looking like a man who'd traveled 14 hours and slept for none of them. Older than Zenobio remembered. Heavier. City weight.
I'm here.
The kind from sitting and eating food other people
I said I'd
caught.
come.
But his face was Zenobio's
Why
face.
did you come back?
Same jawline.
To apologize.
Same deep-set
what?
eyes that narrowed when something
I'm
was
taking
wrong.
you to Manaus. The flood this year, they're saying it could break the 71 record. You can't stay here.
You watch over him.
Zenobio looked at his son, looked past
have
him
work
at
to
the
do.
treehouse visible through the
Still
window,
needs the roof.
his unfinished work sitting in the sapucaia like a promise half kept.
If your shoulder holds
Walls
out,
up, roof not
you
done.
came back.
2 more days of work.
Yes.
Maybe 3 if his
And I'm
shoulder
not
kept
leaving
locking.
without you.
3 days of work, and
3
his son
days I
standing
worked.
in the doorway with a boat
Everything I
and a
built.
plan and 14 years
love
of
was
guilt
leaving, what makes you
compressed
real?
into a demand that sounded like love but felt like erasure.
You think you can just leave us
You
here?
want me to leave?
Give me a second, Dad.
And what happens to everything I built?
Itamar didn't have an answer. The silence between them filled with the sound of water rising
Talk of comfort,
and
but
wood
what, of what
that had
we
been
built here?
groaning
We
all
built this
night
in
long.
chains, Itamar.
The argument
Don't you remember
lasted
what we left
2
behind
hours.
in Manaus?
It covered
You don't
ground they'd
understand
been
what's at stake
circling
here.
for
I'm not listening to this
14
anymore.
years.
Just give me a chance to
Manaus
explain.
versus
Please.
the river, comfort
Safety
versus
versus
belonging,
meaning.
safety versus everything that made life mean
have to go.
something beyond
They're
just
coming.
continuing.
No.
Zenobio sat in his hammock.
You fell last
Itamar
month.
paced the creaking
Donna
floor.
Carminda told me to name you.
Neither
You
was
fell
wrong.
off the ladder and lay in the water
That was
for
the
20
hardest
minutes
part.
before anyone found you.
It was 15
How are you?
minutes. The water was
Washed up.
only waist deep.
Nothing.
And he'd gotten up on his own
Waist deep
before
and nothing.
Carminda started shrieking.
Gone. You're
But the
hurt.
fact that his son knew that someone had called
The
Itamar to
water's too
report his
high.
father floating in floodwater like a loose log, that stung worse than the fall. Zenobio looked at his hands, scarred, swollen
on.
at the joints, the
Hold
right
it.
one
Just hold it.
trembling when he held it still. These hands had built 47 structures, shaped wood that would outlast everyone who'd ever touched it. But the hands themselves were failing, knuckles that locked mid-swing, grip strength that vanished without warning. Mornings where he couldn't close his fist until the sun had been up an hour.
Senor Zenobio,
I said no.
can I still come up to the treehouse?
You don't get to decide.
Even if you go?
That
Her
voice.
voice from the porch.
Who's out there?
She'd heard everything. Sound carried across water without mercy. Zenobio looked at Itamar. Itamar looked at the window, at the thin brown girl perched on the rail with her feet dangling above the flood. Something shifted
Everything I
in the
thought was
room,
true.
not the floor.
It wasn't.
Though the floor shifted
I know,
too
old
because
friend.
the water had risen
never
another
was.
6 centimeters since morning. Something in Zenobio's chest, the place where the lie lived, the belief that his buildings were
The buildings were
him,
not me.
that when the wood rotted,
What I am
he rotted
lives in
with
what
it.
you can
But here
see.
was a 12-year-old who knew why you don't
use
use
nails.
nails. Who understood vines bend with the tree? Who could
hear the
identify
sapucaia.
sapucaia wood by the sound it made when you knocked it? 3 weeks
You
of
are your
watching and she
grandfather's
carried
daughter,
more
aren't
of
you?
Zenobio's
Yes, sir.
knowledge than Itamar
I am
had
Naira.
absorbed in 40 years of being his son. Buildings would fall, every one, even the treehouse. The river would take them the way it took everything. Wood rots, vines snap, trees die and topple into water that erases them. But the knowledge of how to build, that could transfer. That could survive the flood in a way no structure ever could.
You will need this now.
I know.
Itamar, give me 3 days.
His son
I
started to
finished the
argue.
roof.
3 days
Then
was
we
3
talk about
days
Manaus.
too many in a
3 days is
record
3 days
flood.
too many. We have to go
But
now.
something in the old man's face stopped
3
him.
days.
Zenobio
That is all I
wasn't
need.
asking for
Just
time to
3
delay.
days. I must
He was
leave
asking
soon.
for time to finish
But I can
something that
teach you
mattered
this
more
first.
than the building
Teach me?
itself.
Yes, before I go. All right, teach me.
Next morning, Zenobio climbed to the treehouse platform. Naira climbed with him, and for the
Keep
first
your
time
footing.
in 60 years of building, he didn't work in silence.
I have
He
it.
narrated
Slow and
every
steady,
step.
apprentice.
Why this
I have
palm
built
frond
this.
goes over
We
that
must follow
one.
every step.
Water runs off
This is
the
how we
overlap,
survive.
not into the
Do you
seam.
understand?
I understand.
Why the ridge beam
You see,
sits
like this.
6 centimeters
Not
higher
here.
than the wall
Water
line.
goes off the edge. Do you
Expansion
understand?
room
Yes,
for
I
when
see.
humidity
Good.
swells
Now
the
you
wood.
try it. This 6
Why you tie
centimeter
the
gap
final
isn't
knots
just a
from
number. It's
inside
room
the
for the wood to
structure,
breathe,
not
to
outside.
expand with the humidity.
So rain doesn't
It's the
pool
roof's
in the
life.
vine wraps and
You must
rot
tie
them.
it like this from the inside. The rain will not pool and rot the vines.
Yes, I see from the inside. The knot tightens when it's wet.
Zenobio stopped.
That's why you use it
His
for the roof
hands
shaving,
paused
because
on
the
the
rain
vine.
actually makes it
He looked
stronger.
at her, really looked. The way you
You
look at something
understand?
you didn't expect to find. She hadn't just
The
listened,
principle.
she'd understood.
You are ready.
The principle behind the technique, the why beneath the how.
I knew what to do.
The roof went on in 2 days.
Keep pushing it in hard.
Not 3. Because
this?
4 hands
Yes,
work
you're doing
faster
it
than
right.
2,
Good.
even
Good.
when 2 of those
Let's get
hands
the next
are
one.
12 years old and still learning which way to twist a knot. On the final day, Zenobio stood inside the finished treehouse. Solid floor, walls that breathed, roof that would shed water and flex in wind and survive storms that would flatten anything built with nails and concrete. His 48th structure, and the one he was proudest of. Not because it was his best, though it was, but because someone else could explain why every piece was where it was. Itamar came to see it, climbed the tree with the
God, this is
awkward,
high.
heavy movements of a man who'd
Careful,
forgotten
up there.
how.
I'm
He
trying.
stood on the platform,
a
tested
bit
the floor,
further.
looked at the joints, the lattice, the roof. And for the first time since he'd been a boy kicking balls instead of learning his father's trade, he went quiet in the way people get quiet when something earns their respect.
You built this at
Grub.
85
The building was never
in
the
a
point.
tree
I
during a
just hadn't known
record
it
flood.
until you started asking
Zenobio
questions.
shrugged. The building wasn't the point. The building was never the point. He just hadn't
I
known
have no
that
answer.
until a 12-year-old girl started asking questions that forced him to say the answers out loud. He went to Manaus, packed a single bag, machete, hammock, the hand-carved level his father had made from ironwood 50 years before Zenobio was born. Left the stilt house to the flood, left the tree house to the river and the forest, and a girl who knew how to build things that bent instead of breaking. The water peaked 4 days later, 17.3 meters, a record that erased the one from 71. Zenobio's stilt house flooded to the rafters. 3 other homes on the eastern bank collapsed. Doña Carminda's house, predictably, tilted another 12 degrees and lost its roof. The treehouse held. Every joint, every vine, every beam. It sat in the sapucaia canopy like it had always been there, like the tree had grown it instead of a man. In Manaus, Zenobio sat in his son's apartment and looked at concrete walls that would never flex, never breathe, never settle into their foundations, the way living wood settles into living earth.
Absolutely nothing.
He missed the river, missed the sound of water rising, missed the smell of fresh-cut sapucaia and the taste of sawdust. But when Naira called on Itamar's phone 3 weeks later,
the same
voice bright with excitement, connection cutting in and out, and told him she'd repaired the lattice wall where a branch had punched through during the storm, using the same weave he'd taught her, the same vine twist, the same knot that tightened when wet. Zenobio closed his eyes and understood that his 48th structure wasn't a treehouse at all. It was a 12-year-old girl who could build one.